tonight.
Great, thank you, Kim, and nice to see everybody tonight. Yes, I am on the East Coast. I'm actually at the Grazing Land Coalition meeting, and I'll be speaking tomorrow on a similar topic. So it's nice that I'm able to join you this evening and kind of share my interest in grazing. I'm with UC Cooperative Extension. I'm the county director for Sonoma County, but I'm also the livestock and range management farm advisor in Sonoma County, and I've been very interested in grazing my whole career, but in particular since the last 4 years of catastrophic fires, I see grazing as one of the important tools to help reduce vegetation and maintain a level after a fire that would be safe. And so I want to talk to you tonight about a project that I've been working on for a while. And I'm going to start that right now. So I want to talk about Make America Graze Again, or what I call is MAGA. And I want to discuss with you tonight the benefits of grazing. So it could be grazing on pasture land, rangeland, or in forest. So when we think about grazing, we think about it utilizing rangeland vegetation. So whether it's on rangelands or forested lands, it's utilizing the vegetation that might impact the health of the situation, that might help achieve goals of a grazer, a cattle producer, goat grazer, or it could achieve the goals of the resources. So reducing any invasive species or any brush, or reducing the chances of fire by reducing that fire ladder. So the grasses being the fine fuels, the brush being the intermediate, and then up into the trees. So this, if you're looking at managing forages, grazing might be the tool that would help reduce the potential for fire. So grazing by wild and domestic animals is natural, and it, along with fire, as in prescribed fire, is one of the oldest vegetation management tools, and it does change communities. And so you have to think about is, what do I want the community to look like? And what am I hoping it will look like after a fire? And what comes back, how can I manage it to get it to that level that I want it to be at? So we have lots of different vegetation management options. And when you think about all those options, whether it's chemical or fire or mechanical or hand labor or grazing, you really want to think about what the costs are. What's the availability? So how accessible is that area I want to manage? Is it close to a road? Is it close to my structures? Is it on a steep slope? So what's the access to it? Is it easy to get to? Will it be very difficult? And will 4 legs get there easier than 2 legs? Is it practical? Does it make sense to have grazing there? Do I have the infrastructure that would help maintain those animals on that property? What's the policy? So maybe there's a policy that says you cannot graze there, or you can only graze a certain time of the year, and I can only graze a certain number of animals. So what's the policy that might pertain to those vegetation management options? Is it socially acceptable? Do people accept those different kinds of tools? We know that we can't always use prescribed fire in certain areas, but maybe we could balance that with grazing. And what's the environmental impact? Many of us have suffered catastrophic fires and know what the environmental impact is of those fires. And so what are the tools in the toolbox that we can use? And I would suggest that we use them all where it makes sense. But in particular, we're going to focus on grazing as a tool that could be used pre-fire, but definitely a tool that would be used post-fire to help maintain the vegetation at a level that we find acceptable. So we think about grazing as an option. We can use it for grazing range and pasture lands. We use it as a way to reduce the use of chemicals. So we don't want to have herbicides getting in and affecting the quality of the groundwater. People are opposed to using chemicals. It doesn't mean that you can't use it, but again, it might be an option for that. If we use grazing instead of mechanical vegetation, it's going to reduce the fuel cost because we're not driving our tractors around. And many of us that have driven tractors and masticators and different things, you know that you can only graze them during certain times of the year. If it's too wet, they're likely to get stuck or to slide or overturn. So we don't want that. So they're weather dependent. And it's also, they're going to produce carbon emissions when we use those. And so we want to consider that. Could reduce our labor cost. We know that bringing in crews to reduce vegetation, either hand crews or doing some shaded fuel breaks, the labor can be expensive. And if we do grazing correctly, we can improve soil quality. So we're looking at improving soil infiltration through the water with a hoof action can do that. We can also improve the fertility of the soil with organic matter. And then if we're grazing maybe associated vineyards and orchards, it could also improve the yield or the quality of the fruit. And we can incorporate grazing into organic and sustainable vineyard or orchard management practices. And maybe that would apply in forested areas as well. So there's lots of objectives when we think about using grazing. So let's ask us the question, why would we graze? Well, grazing can be more cost effective on landscapes that are definitely too steep, rocky, or remote for conventional vegetation management, like mowing or chemical treatment, or in particular, where we have that urban wildland interface or the WUI, where burning is not an option. So that takes out those tools, and so we can look at grazing. When we think about targeted grazing, when you think about the word targeted, it means that you have a specific resource target, and think about with like an arrow as you're shooting it toward the bullseye. You're using a specific type of livestock to maybe impact invasive species or enhance the habitat and restore it, and particularly reduce those fine fuels, those grasses. And if you're using particularly goat species, you're going to reduce those brush species that feed into those ladder fuels that then affect our trees in our forest. And so it could reduce the severity of fires. And then you have to think about, well, what kind of livestock do I want? I know people are very interested in goats. You can use goats, you can use sheep, you can use cattle, you can use horses, or you can use a combination of all of those species. But it really is going to depend on what your goals are, what the targeted species that you want to target or reduce or enhance. And you have to think about the other pieces like infrastructure and what makes sense for that landscape and which animal to use. So grazing doesn't come without labor, though. There are labor costs. And so you have to think about who's going to manage those grazing animals, whether they move from pasture to pasture or range to forest or vice versa. And it's going to take some skilled labor. And you need to work calmly with your animals, and so that you can move them efficiently. There's less stress. But you also need to have labor that's good at dealing with landowners or agency personnel or the general public, or in particular other animals. So that's a skill that you have to find. You have to think also about using your hauling animals and equipment. So you have to come with a truck and trailer to move those animals around if you're going from large pasture sizes or forested areas, and you're going to move these animals along a fence in a truck and a trailer, and you're going to move them to different grazing sites. And then you have to take into account that these animals graze year round, but you may not have that grazing land available year round. And so to maintain the animal's health, maintain the economic viability of a grazing operation, we're always looking for what we call home sites, where those animals can go when they don't have a place to go and graze. So you have to work with particular landowners or agency groups that are going to allow you to have that place where you can come and rest your animals until you can move on to the next grazing operation. In particular, in the forested areas, we have to be concerned about these novel or toxic plants that animals aren't used to or maybe haven't seen before. And so if there are species that would be toxic to the livestock, we have to be aware of that and work around those. So we have to have specific timing, or we have to know areas to fence those areas out of, because we want to make sure that we enhance the nutrition for the animals that are grazing, but be aware of any toxic or special plants that we want to protect. So we have to work around those. We usually fence those or we flag those. And so it's working to understand that not all plants can be grazed by animals. And in particular, if somebody was to throw, clippings or things that they've clipped and the plant wilts, then the animal can't really tell what species it is, and they're not familiar with that, and that could be a real concern. So we always caution people in an urban area to, in particular, not to throw lawn clippings or anything like that over the fence. In areas that are larger, like in range and forested areas, we have to worry about predation. So when we're moving animals into a forested area or rangelands, they usually come with a guard dog or many guard dogs or electric fence, so that it helps keep those animals safe from predation and safe at night when those animals are usually bedded up. And so there's a lot of logistics involved in that. So you'll usually come with a herder and they'll move those animals around and stay with the animals. Certain land agencies don't allow any kind of firearms. And so it's just up to the herder or the land manager to work together to help reduce the amount of predation that might occur. And then bottom line is that these animals are the workers for that grazer. And so that grazer wants them to maintain their health and maintain the ability to provide shade and shelter for them. And thinking about, if they have natural disasters, if we have thunderstorms or fires or any kind of evacuation needs, on how do we train people to evacuate these animals and to be prepared to do so when that happens. So those are some of the concerns that we think about when we're looking at animal production. So if we think about grazing from a carbon or a GHG perspective, which is really important because we have to balance, grazing animals with the natural resources, with the goals of the land, and then looking at through a fire lens of what's the best tools that we can use to help reduce catastrophic fires while maintaining the health of the landscape. So when we think about livestock and grazing, they are part of the biogenic carbon cycle. And that's where CO2 that's in the atmosphere is converted to carbohydrates, then grazed by cattle, and then cattle then release methane. Cattle release methane, as do wild animals that are ruminants, as do sheep and goats. And so that is the function of a ruminant, is that when they digest, they ructate and release methane. But burning fossil fuels also can emit CO2 into the atmosphere. And so we have to look at this balance of that. And then we have to think about it that we have well-managed grazing, more efficient grazing, that can increase the water holding capacity of our lands. That's going to improve the soil biome health, increases biodiversity. It's going to enhance carbon sequestration in soil. And it can be that long-term solution for reducing GHG emissions. As I mentioned earlier, grazing can reduce the fine fuels, which then can reduce the severity of wildfires. And grazing aids in weed management and the need for mechanical, like fossil fuels and chemicals as in herbicides. So let me just take you a quick walk through these greenhouse gases, recognizing that carbon dioxide can last in the atmosphere for up to 1,000 years. Methane lasts just 10 years, and nitrous oxide will last 110 years. And this is information from the UC Davis Clear Center. So when we think about methane, there's lots of different sources of methane, whether it's fossil fuels through the production and use, whether it's agriculture and waste or biomass burning. There's also wetlands, and there's natural emissions such as lakes and termites and oceans. And so methane exists naturally in our world. And so when we talk about grazing animals, we have to also think about all the other sources of methane as well. It's not just the ruminants. So I want to show you like a comparison when we think about greenhouse gases and as they relate to grazing on rangelands. Say we were to burn 1,000 pounds of air-dried annual grass. It's going to generate 5 pounds of particulates and 1,829 pounds of CO2 and 2 pounds of methane. So that's with a fire. Looking at comparing it to grazing that same 1,000 pounds of annual grass, which is going to feed that cow for 1 month. And she's going to produce a food source that we can eat. She's eating grass that we can't eat to turn it into a food source that we can eat. That equivalent is only 375 pounds of CO2. Yes, they are producing about 5 times as much methane gas, but as I pointed out, methane doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as the CO2. So much less CO2 produced from a cow and the equivalent of burning fire. So just to really kind of drive home that biogenic carbon cycle, when we think about CO2 in the atmosphere, that occurs through photosynthesis. When CO2 is captured through photosynthesis, it then moves into the grasslands and it is stored in the soil, carbon, through carbohydrates in the rooting system of the plants. When we do grazing, and proper grazing will enhance that rooting system It will increase the carbon that is sequestered in that soil. The grazing animal comes along and grazes that grass, which then entices those roots to go further down into the soil. It will then rotate the methane, but in 10 years, it will change back to CO2 and the cycle continues. And so cattle grazing and ruminant grazing is part of that biogenic carbon cycle that allows that methane to recycle into the atmosphere and thus going back into the soil to be sequestered as carbon. And if we don't do grazing, that cycle tends to slow down and eventually will stop. So with that, I have been pushing the idea of we need to graze more. Grazing more from a fire reduction, a vegetation management, and part of the GHG emission piece that we can sequester carbon by using grazing as our tool. And I developed match.graze, which is at this website, and you can use this QR code to get to that. So match.graze is a free online platform that connects livestock producers and landowners throughout the state of California. Match.graze is a dating service, as I like to say, for livestock producers, and they can help pair up these animals with land bases. So people that have land that don't have animals. And so through this service, we're hoping to support the expanded use of grazing to achieve California's collective habitat enhancement and fuel reduction goals. So how it got started, well, after the 2017 fire in Sonoma County, the Tubbs and the Nun, I said we really need to manage vegetation. Well, we didn't manage it right away, and we had a really good rain season, and by gosh, from that, we had a whole bunch more vegetation that needed to be managed. And the cycle just keeps continuing. We're not, addressing this need to manage our vegetation through all the tools. And so it's a way to increase livestock grazing to manage, and in particular areas that we cannot mow and we cannot burn. I saw this at the South Dakota Grazing Exchange, and they were using it as a way to promote healthy soils. So they weren't looking at it through a fire lens, they were looking at it through a healthy soils lens and felt that grazing was a tool to improve the health of the soils. And like I said, Match.graze is working to preserve and enhance the natural resources, manage fire fuels, sequester carbon, and support our local agriculture. So I look at this grazing as three scales. So I call them the 3 tiers. And it could be a community. So if you have, Kim was just talking about small scale forests, we have small scale landowners as well. So say you have a 1/4 acre to 2 or 3 acres, and you're in a community that would allow you to move your animals from place to place. So you have one small scale grazer, could have sheep or goats or a few cattle, and they'll move from place to place, from parcel to parcel. And usually no money is exchanged. There's no payment for grazing. There's no charge for the grazing service. And what it does is brings the community together. And so it doesn't cost any money. There's no transportation costs because their animals are usually moved down the road. And so it's a way to build community. You get to know your neighbors. You might be able to share a barbecue at the end of the grazing season. But it really does help reduce those fire risk among those small scale community owners. Then you probably heard about contract or targeted grazing. This is where you pay someone to come in and graze your property. So you're determining the type of livestock you want, whether it's goats, sheep, or cattle. You determine the season that they're there, the specific goals, natural resources that you want them to achieve, and you typically pay that grazer to achieve those goals. Then there's the commercial grazers. So that's when a livestock producer will pay the landowner to graze their property. Could be seasonal, it could be year round, and their goal is to meet the nutritional and production goals of the livestock. So depending on what you're looking to do and depending on how much you need to do, you can choose different types of scales when achieving goals and grazing together. So here's Match.graze. And so it's got features. And so what it is, it offers tools in which can help you define the best grazing match. And it's an interactive grazing match. And you go online and you make a custom custom pin, whether you want a sheep or a goat or a cow on it. And there's a lot of resources to help with the grazing, and there's a how-to video. And so you can see when we started this early 2021, there was a few pins out there. And just this last month in November, we've got a full-on set of lots of grazers and lots of landowners out there. So what we're finding is that we need to find more people and more opportunities for these grazers, and see how we can expand this and get more and driving more people to this site, whether it's public or private landowners, and having more interactions. We've definitely had some matches, we've had some successes, but we'd like to have more. So all you want to do is, if you are a grazer or if you have land, you just go on this site, you create your free account. You can put whatever you'd like in your profile. You could talk about your cows, you could talk about your land. I've looked at a lot of the different profiles, and it's pretty much people telling them that they have, this many acres, or looking for this kind of property, etc. And so then you make that exchange. What I'm finding is that we have a lot of landowners that really want grazing, but don't have the infrastructure. And so I think that's one of the key pieces we'll be looking for going forward, is how do we get more opportunities for people to implement these infrastructures, so it would be fencing and water, so that we can actually get everybody or more people start grazing. So in closing, I just want to say that every property is different, and it requires a lot of consideration on which grazing animal you want and how you want to implement them, and what your goals are, whether it's for fire fuel reduction, carbon sequestration, or biodiversity. It's really important that you think that through. You talk it with the grazer so that you're both on the same page. And it's really important to understand that these animals also need levels of nutrition. And so when you have them coming in at a time when maybe the nutrition's not as high as you'd like it to be, you have to kind of balance that. And thinking of a short-term solution, contract grazing may be the way to go, but you're not going to always pay somebody to graze, because it's a little more expensive. Some of the rates in our area are around $1,000 an acre for targeted grazing, which will be good to get the brush and things down to a certain level. And then if you could put infrastructure in, so that then you could then bring grazers back in that maybe you don't have to pay them, or they pay you. So there's lots of different options, but the main thing is to think about grazing as a tool and how you can implement it on your different operations. So with that, I'll stop for questions.
Stephanie, does anybody have any questions for Stephanie about match.graze or how to find and work with a contract grazer? You can unmute yourself, or you can put your question in the chat box. While we wait just a moment, go ahead, Christina.
Stephanie, thank you for this wonderful, really informative presentation. I had a question for you. In a very rural area surrounded by forests, if I was to get a few goats, are electric fences pretty bulletproof, against mountain lions and coyotes? Or is there really no? I keep hearing from local foresters, if you're going to get goats, be ready to lose some, and I'm just not very comfortable with that.
It depends on the situation. I've seen sometimes where they might put double electric fence around, so if they learn to jump it. Coyotes are pretty if they're going to get shocked, they're not going to come in. Mountain lions, I think, are different. If they're really wanting to get in, some people will have guard dogs with them as well. Or if you have a herder with them, that human presence tends to keep them away. But again, there's no sure proof of it. Safe haven for them. Mountain lions will get into areas that are in a barn if they really want to get in. So you might want to think about, maybe making like a double fencing with electric fences to protect them. That way, I know they do that in certain other areas when they're dealing with lions. They will make two pens.
Mhm. That's a good tip. Thank you.
Mhm.
I have a question, Kevin, here. Does it matter size of property? Is smaller properties better, big properties better, or is there any variability in the size of the property you're working on?
There's no variability. It's just going to depend on, the smaller the property, the shorter period of time that those animals will be grazing, because they need, certain level of forage to keep them grazing. So if you have a small property and you want to have animals, you probably only have a few. And that's where that community grazing has been really helpful, because they'll move quickly. They may only be there a day or two and then they're moving them, but they don't have to load up in a truck. They just move them down the road to the next property. So that piece didn't matter what the size was. It's more the timing, how long they're there. And just keep in mind that, if you've got one cow, so the equivalent is about 5 sheep. So if you've got a small property, you may only have 1 cow on it versus 5 sheep.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, one more quick question. Stephanie, what do people do during mandatory evacuations? There are a few organizations that help, but there's so few of them. So have you been hearing how private landowners deal with during mandatory evacuations with their animals?
It's just going to depend on the size. In Sonoma County, we've had the smaller scales where people were loading up the small animals, goats and sheep, and getting them out. Horses absolutely always evacuated. For the most part, the larger cattle producers stay in place, and their biggest concern is the health of the animals. So they want to make sure that they have enough space to move around if the fire comes through, not leaving them locked in a barn or in a small pen. And they pretty much take care of themselves unless they, they're scared and they run. But we've only on a certain occasion evacuated a few of the larger producers. But I know Tracy and Dan have had other experiences as well, where you just have multiple producers coming in with trailers and loading up all the cattle and moving them. So it's going to depend on the severity and the ability to quickly access those animals and get them out.
Much appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to turn things over to Dan and Tracy, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
Great. Well, thank you for a great presentation, Stephanie. I think Stephanie's signed off and probably going to bed knowing Stephanie. But I'm Dan Macon. I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with Cooperative Extension in the Sierra Foothills. I cover Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties, and I'm also the county director for Placer and Nevada, and have also, over the last 20 years or so, been a grazing practitioner and done targeted grazing primarily with sheep and goats, both kind of at a community scale and then on a very large scale, managing several thousand head of sheep and goats in Lincoln and Rockland. And I'll let Tracy introduce herself.
Hi, good evening. My name is Tracy Schohr, and I am a Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor, and I cover Butte, Plumas, and Sierra counties. And also, like Dan, both have the professional experience, but also our family has worked with both Land Trust and the Air Force on grazing with cattle to actually meet natural resource objectives. And so bringing forth that experiences from working with local producers in the counties, but also on a personal side as well tonight.
And we'll have a little bit of overlap tonight with what Stephanie talked about, but I think we'll try to cover kind of the practical application of these tools and share some of our experiences, both with contract grazing and then with leased grazing. And again, I hope you'll put questions in the chat as we go through. Can everybody see the slides okay? All right. These are my sheep eating poison. These are my sheep eating poison oak, and I would not recommend shearing sheep shortly after they have been in poison oak like this. I just say that from experience. So the big ideas that we're going to talk about this evening are, there's this perception out there, as Stephanie alluded to, that goats are the only targeted grazing species. And we're going to talk about kind of the application of all of the domestic ruminant species in a targeted grazing situation. Talk a little more about where targeted grazing fits with other fuels management tools and expand a little bit on what Stephanie had to say. We'll talk a little bit about how important it is to know the plants that you're trying to impact, what animals will eat, what they won't, and why. And we'll talk a little bit about some invasive plants and some toxic plants as well. We'll get into a little more depth on grazing principles and about this idea of grazing density, because I think in terms of particular goals and managing fuels, that's a really important conversation. Spend a little time on predator protection, on infrastructure, and then on funding and costs, and wrap up with a conversation about leasing your property. So to define targeted grazing, this really comes out of some work that was done by researchers at University of Idaho and Texas A&M, Karen Launchbaugh and John Walker. And targeted grazing is the application of a specific kind of livestock at a determined season, duration, and intensity to accomplish defined vegetation or landscape goals. The main difference in targeted grazing versus kind of conventional grazing management is that we're refocusing the outputs of grazing from livestock production to vegetation and landscape management. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means from a practical perspective. Grazing and prescribed fire, as Stephanie said, are really the only fuels management tools out there that actually remove fuel. If you think about mastication or hand piling or string trimming or mowing or even herbicide application, those fuels are still there. They've just changed their condition. But grazing and prescribed fire actually remove fuels from the landscape. And if we think about comparing them to these other tools that we commonly use in forested landscapes, where grazing, I think, can really excel is in both modifying the fuel profile and removing the fuel from the landscape, and being able to be applied across a wide range of topographic, land use, and ecological constraints. Now, I will admit that my sheep have escaped at times, in which case I may have to buy several flats of marigolds to replace those that they ate in a neighborhood. But we don't really hear about livestock escaping and destroying whole neighborhoods or homes. And I think while there's certainly a place for prescribed fire, as I'm learning from my colleagues and from other practitioners, there's a difference there in terms of potential risk. So to think a little bit about the difference between targeted grazing versus livestock production, and I'll explain these pictures briefly. The picture on the left is my friend Brad Fowler, who's here in the Nevada, Placer County region, using goats to manage vegetation at, now it's, I think it's Alpine Meadows up in the Tahoe Basin. Doing their summer vegetation management with goats, as opposed to this picture of my sheep. And most of what I get paid for in raising my sheep is the wool and the offspring that they produce. And there's some real different considerations when we're thinking about targeted grazing versus livestock production. From a vegetation management standpoint, oftentimes we're going to see mixed flocks, sheep and goats, sometimes cattle as well. There'll be a variety of age classes. There are goat targeted grazers that will use older castrated males or wethers because they can really impact brush and low quality vegetation without stressing themselves nutritionally. If your focus is livestock production, you're really going to focus more on a particular species. You may be operating where you have a breeding flock and then younger female animals graze separately. And typically those wethers are marketed or sold to generate income for the business. In a vegetation management situation, our primary income streams are going to be grazing contracts, where if focused on livestock production, we're selling lambs and kids or calves. We may be selling fiber, but we're really generating income off of what those animals produce. We can flip that around. Certainly the vegetation management businesses that are around do sell offspring, do sell fiber, but it may be of lower quality or lower weight, and so it's not as critical to their income stream. There are livestock producers, ourselves included, that do some seasonal targeted grazing when we know we're not going to impact the females that we depend on for our income. In terms of management emphasis, vegetation management business is going to make animals available for grazing contracts and really try to maximize the days that they're getting paid. They're going to operate with high stock density to impact vegetation more uniformly, and I'll talk about that in just a few more slides. But because of that, they may accept some nutritional stress on the animals. If they're trying to impact vegetation at a time of year when it's not highly nutritious, they may incur some nutritional stress. A livestock producer is really going to be focused on reproduction and on the pounds of offspring that they're marketing. They're also going to focus on fiber quality and the weight of the fiber that they're harvesting and selling. And as a consequence, they're really going to focus on optimizing nutrition at key times. And for sheep and goats, those key times would be prior to breeding, just prior to and during lambing or kidding. And so we're really going to focus on not stressing those animals nutritionally during those time frames. And then finally, reproduction, if you're in the vegetation management business, is really going to be timed to allow maximum days on contracts and to avoid those animals giving birth while they're on contracts. And as a consequence, we often see lower conception rates, lower weaning weights, because the focus is on increasing that grazing income. On the livestock production side of things, we're going to time our peak nutritional demand, as I said, late gestation and lactation, with peak forage quality and quantity. And really, we also focus on that nutritional intake just prior to breeding to maintain conception rates and lambing or kidding rates. So when we have done targeted grazing, I always thought it would be really handy to have playing cards that we could give out to neighborhoods and to law enforcement, so that when they called and said your goats are out, and I told them I didn't have goats, we didn't get into an argument about what was out there grazing the landscape. But goats really are broadleaf plant browsers. They will prefer broadleaves and brush. They like to browse from the shoulder level up, and so they may actually crawl up into higher brush plants and defoliate them. They're pregnant for about 5 months, and you hear people talking about buck goats or billy goats. Females are called does, and the offspring are called kids. Sheep will prefer a mix of grasses and broadleaf plants, including some brush. And some sheep really like brush, but they typically will look from shoulder level down in terms of grazing. So they'll absolutely defoliate low brush, but they're not going to climb up into the high decadent brush that a goat might impact. They are also pregnant for about 5 months. You'll hear males referred to as bucks or rams. The females are ewes, and the offspring are lambs. And then cattle prefer mostly grass, but they will eat some broadleaf plants, clovers and things like that. On the west slope of the Sierra, there are herds of cattle that do very, very well on some of the deciduous ceanothus and other brush species. And in fact, the Forest Service has what they call transitory range grazing allotments, where cattle are used on some of that deer brush or deciduous ceanothus. They'll typically look down to graze. A really key point here is that they are pregnant for 9 months. And if we're maintaining nutritional intake during their gestation period, we may not be able to put them on some of the lower quality forages that we could put a sheep or a goat on. So just to kind of recap here, thinking about dietary preferences, grazing behavior, one of the advantages of cattle is that they are typically less susceptible to predators in many cases, but they do typically require more expensive infrastructure. We operate our sheep business with virtually no permanent fencing whatsoever and with no corrals whatsoever. And because they're smaller animals, we can get by with that, whereas if we were running cattle, it would take a bit more infrastructure. Tracy, do you want to comment on the cattle infrastructure question a little bit? Is there anything you want to add there?
So I think with the cattle side, you do have to have a lot more of the infrastructure, but there are producers that are very well equipped to bring in their own corral system, but that permanent fencing, the cattle typically are not usually in larger landscapes put out with just targeted or with electric fence. They don't necessarily have 24-hour care with them. And so that would be a different infrastructure to go into. However, like Dan was mentioning, the cattle producers also have a lot of that same infrastructure, and there is interest in partnerships to implement that infrastructure or those fence repairs as part of a partnership for a longer term agreement. And so that might be something just to think about as you're running through options, depending on the size of your landscape of what may fit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the other question is, you've got this vegetation, but are the animals you've brought in going to eat it and do well on it? So just like our own food consumption, palatability varies by the species of the plant, by the time of year, by the stage of growth. And it also varies by what the animal's already been exposed to. So if I stop and think about the kinds of foods that I prefer to eat, there's a whole long list of things that I learned to eat from my folks because that's what we served when I was a kid. And believe it or not, livestock learned some of those same preferences by watching their mothers graze and getting in tune with when particular plants are palatable and nutritious. Many of the brush species that we see in forested landscapes here in the Sierra are highly palatable and nutritious. Deciduous ceanothus, or what I grew up calling deer brush, is got similar nutritional characteristics as alfalfa hay, high in protein, very digestible. Wedge-leaf ceanothus is also very nutritious and palatable, certainly for goats and for sheep. Coyote brush, we can tell when it's time to move our sheep when they've started to hit the coyote brush and the paddocks we're grazing. So it's not their first choice, but they will graze it, and it does have some good nutritional value. Himalayan blackberry is kind of like, if you're running sheep in that, it's kind of like the invention of Velcro. They'll get hung up in the blackberries, but it is very, very nutritious and has a place in terms of grazing management. Live oak is palatable primarily to goats, although I have seen sheep eat it as well. It does have some more tannic acid to it, and so that limits some of its palatability, but goats will definitely impact live oak. And then I've got some pictures here later of sheep, and goats will do the same, impacting yellow star thistle very effectively. I think it's important to remember that livestock aren't mechanical masticators, though. So if you've got 15 high foot old growth manzanita, they're probably not going to impact to the same level that mechanical treatment will. But we can use heavier weather goats to do what we call mob browse, taller brush plants. And these are goats that may weigh upwards of 230, 240 pounds, that if they're standing on their hind legs can reach 8 feet into the air. And I've seen those mobs kind of collectively push over large brush plants so that the rest of the animals can defoliate. And then you've got a bare stem after that. They won't typically eat the woody parts of the plant, and that is something to keep in mind.
So
timing is
on what Dan
yeah,
said.
go ahead.
A good thing to think about is that it's not a one size fits all sometimes with livestock grazing. And so, thinking about the brush, and if you have an extensive amount of it, maybe your first step might be mastication, and then your long-term management
Exactly.
Could be goats, or you could add that as a combination tool where you could come in and do some targeted areas to kind of jumpstart the goats or sheep to give them an edge on meeting your objectives for that piece of property.
I think that's a great point. Livestock can be a really effective maintenance tool to maintain work that you've already done. And I think grazing can also be used kind of as a preparatory tool for prescribed fire, where we're creating some modification to the fuel profile in advance of using fire on the landscape as well. Timing is critically important, both in terms of the palatability of the plant and the nutritional requirements of the animal. Yellow star thistle is a great example. We want to graze yellow star thistle when about 10% of the plants are flowering, because if we stress those plants at that stage in their growth, we're going to vastly reduce seed production. And so over the course of several years, we can really start to impact a stand of yellow star thistle if our timing is right. Some plants do have secondary compounds that make them less susceptible to grazing. Some may have other types of protections like spines or thorns, but manzanita at certain times of year is not terribly palatable. My experience with coffeeberry and toyon is that there's a pretty narrow window when the animals will browse on those plants, and the rest of the year they ignore them in favor of other things. I've also observed with sheep and goats both that when poison oak first starts to leaf out, they'll hit it really hard. As it starts to turn color and drop leaves, they're less likely to graze it at that point. There is some really interesting research out that suggests that sheep and goats have some differing chemical properties in their saliva that make them better suited to grazing spiny plants, particularly thistles, but also potentially blackberries. And goats in particular can really decimate Himalayan blackberries in the fall when they're trying to go dormant. So that's another issue that can be used effectively. Toxic plants, as Stephanie mentioned, can be problematic. And there are things for cattle like pine needles that can create some reproductive issues. Certainly none of us want oleander tossed over the fence to our critters. There are some wild plants like hemlock, like azalea, that we see in forested landscapes that can be problematic. What I found from a practical standpoint is that unless animals are being stressed nutritionally, they're not going to eat enough of a toxic plant to be a problem. They may sample it, decide that it gave them a stomach ache or it doesn't taste right, and walk away from it. But if they're hungry and there's nothing else for them to eat, toxic plants can be an issue. So if we think about grazing impacts from animals, certainly we're removing that herbaceous material, but we can also use grazing animals to trample vegetation and to cycle nutrients. This is a picture of our sheep in a stand of milk thistle and Italian thistle 3 summers ago. And somewhere I have an after picture of this stand of thistle. It was gone within 24 hours, and partly because the sheep trampled it into the ground. So in addition to removing fuels, we can modify fuel profiles through these other impacts. So we can choose where we're going to walk animals through a particular piece of the landscape. And if we're able to trample that vegetation down, we can reduce the amount of oxygen circulating around that fuel bed. And we've seen examples of that over these last several years of where even trampling fuels with livestock has modified fire behavior. We can also select where we're going to bed animals down, in particular with sheep and goats. And that's going to be an area where they may deposit more manure and urine and transfer nutrients from the place that they've been grazing to the place that they've bedded down. I think we do need to manage people's expectations. Livestock are not like a lawnmower or a string trimmer. And so the appearance of the landscape when they're done may be patchy. It's not going to look like it's all 1-inch high fine fuel or masticated brush fields. And it's likely in many cases that it's going to take multiple seasons of grazing to have the kind of long-term impact that we're trying to get. Stephanie mentioned this. This is I think, a point that seems simple, but in practice, it creates a lot of the logistical challenges associated with targeted grazing. I can't put sheep in the shed when they're done on a particular project. They've got to eat every day of the year. And so we've got part of what you're paying somebody to graze to do is to figure out where those animals were going to be before they got to your property and where they're going next. And that can be a fair bit of logistical challenge depending on where you're operating. I have observed that sheep and goats can be somewhat non-selective. My first experience with goats was in a property that had been replanted following the Ponderosa fire in Placer County in 2001. And the first year, the landowner had replanted mostly Ponderosa and sugarcline. And in year 2, we introduced goats into that system to try to manage the brush, and they did eat a lot of the candles off the conifers. But after year 2, those trees were all up high enough and were less palatable, and we had good survival with them. So I think just being aware of that going in. And then lastly, as Stephanie alluded to, grazing can work well where other tools are too costly or inappropriate. Targeted grazing is not necessarily the low-cost option, but it can be an option where the ground is too steep to get equipment in or get people in, or where it's inappropriate to use herbicides for whatever reason. And so they can be a really important tool in some of those more difficult types of situations. Anything you'd add there, Tracy?
No, but we did have some clarifying questions. I don't know if we want to answer those now before we get into the other topics while we're still talking about.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one, I think maybe dive just a little bit deeper into, about goats and sheep are not necessarily great for that woody brush, but how can they be with blackberry and poison oak? So I think just clarifying what we were talking about the dead decadent versus new growth in terms of a management strategy.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll maybe use an anecdote as an example of how we would use them to impact brush. What we found on this property in Colfax was that repeated browsing of the brush maintained the brush at a level where it was not going to create flame lengths that would be detrimental to the forested landscape. And so, for example, the wedge-leaf ceanothus, or what I call buckbrush, it will grow with the right kind of moisture. If it's not impacted, it's going to put on 12 to 18 inches of leader growth a year in a good year. With repeated browsing with goats, we were able to maintain the buckbrush at about 12 to 18 inches height total. Blackberries would be another great example. If we can defoliate blackberries repeatedly in the fall when they're going dormant, when they're trying to store energy in their roots, we remove those solar panels as they're trying to store energy, and we can actually kill those plants eventually. And then we can go through and crush them with equipment or burn those dead canes off, but we've killed the plant. We've killed its ability to come back from those root wads. Good question.
So just building on what Dan said about the trampling aspect, we've actually been able to do that with cattle as well. If you in a drought situation, sometimes you might need to feed a little supplemental hay, or there's protein tubs. You can actually put those in the middle of a blackberry bush, and the cattle won't necessarily eat the blackberry bush, but they will trample it. And then you're able to go back. We went back with a chemical treatment that was very spot specific just on the new leaders that were coming out. And so I think this combination of integrated management is something really to think about. Moving on to the other question. Have you seen goats eating new bay sprouts? They've had some that have come up post-fire, and they've heard that from goat herders that they don't like the bays.
I've had a little bit of experience again in Colfax with that. I think part of it depends on what the goats are exposed to as young animals. If they're exposed to it and create an affinity for it, they can impact it. Many of the plants that are aromatic like that are a little bit more difficult to impact with livestock. Those aromatics can be part of the plant's defense against browsing. And so it's kind of a mixed bag in my experience. In terms of objectives for a targeted grazing contract, most of the contracts that I've seen will specify a level of impact. So it may be, rather than an amount removed, it may be the expected amount of vegetation remaining at the end of the grazing contract. Brush is a little more difficult, and I think we're learning how to specify those targets as we go. We don't have a good methodology for measuring removal of vegetation on brush species with livestock. There is some work that's been done by the Forest Service to kind of measure the removal of current growth year leader growth, and that may be a place for us to start. I think we can also come up with some quantitative measure of the degree of defoliation on particular brush species. But again, I think part of the challenge here is that it's typically not a one-time application. We didn't get to the point where we are in terms of our brush species in a single year, and we can't expect any kind of treatment in a single year to fix that problem. And grazing, I would certainly add to that mix. Tracy, would you add anything to that from your experience?
No, I think you did a really good job of covering that one.
All right, so principles of managed grazing. I think the really important thing as a landowner and as a grazer is to think about what your goal is. You know, is it removing those annual fine fuels? Is it maintaining fuel breaks or other types of woody vegetation removal? Is your goal, as mine would be, to produce meat and fiber and milk? Are you trying to control invasive weeds? Generally, notwithstanding some of the things that Stephanie said, I think more intensive management are going to yield more desirable results if your goal is to manage that vegetation. But at the same time, more intensity often means more time and maybe more money. So one of the principles that we use is to adjust the rest period to match the growth rates of the plants. If we're trying to remove a particular plant or severely impact it, we flip that principle around. We may try to come back and graze that plant again before it's recovered from the first grazing. Yellow star thistle is a great example. We may try to purposely overgraze yellow star thistle in order to limit its seed production. And so we can use the inverse of that grazing principle to our advantage in that case. The other piece of this is that we try to use the shortest graze period possible while maintaining that rest. And so even in a community-based situation, probably everybody in the community would prefer to have the fuel load reduced before the peak of fire season. And so there's going to be this pressure to get through that landscape as quickly as possible. And so those short graze periods to get us to that utilization level are important. One of the ways we can do that is to use the highest stock density possible. If I go to a potluck and I'm one of 2 or 3 people in line, I'm only going to take the stuff I like, right? If there's a whole long line ahead of me and a whole long line behind me at a potluck, I'm going to take some of everything to make sure I get to try stuff. And grazing animals work on that same competitive principle. If we're using a high stock density, I'm going to take a bite of a plant that maybe is not my favorite plant, because I know if I don't, my neighbor's going to get it before I do. And there is kind of this competitive grazing behavior involved in managing those impacts. And then the other piece of that is that we want to use that large herd size. And large is relative here. A large herd size in my landscape may be different than Tracy's landscape. But if we have that optimal herd size, we're also going to optimize the amount of trampling effect we have and the amount of nutrient cycling that we're able to do and really focus those impacts on the landscape. Now, I think the other piece of this is we're going into a time of year, for example, where I am here in Auburn, where we're not going to grow much forage for the sheep. And so we try to adjust our system where we have fewer mouths or at least less demand at those slow times compared to when we're really growing vegetation rapidly. And we can use this principle in a targeted grazing scenario as well, that, you know, we can really increase our stocking rate to have the kind of impact on a particular vegetation type, and then reduce through our management later on in the year. Look at the chat here real quick. For the Sierra Nevada, Quercus species are on the poisonous plants. Great question, Ryan. So one of the things that I have found with my sheep, and maybe Tracy's cattle are smarter than my sheep, but my sheep rarely read the books about toxic plants. And so this time of year, we'll go into a new paddock and the sheep will consume acorns. They will consume oak leaves, live oak primarily, but they will also eat some black oak leaves. The books suggest that the tannin content in oaks is problematic and potentially toxic. What I found in practice is that if animals have enough variety in their diet, they can buffer the impacts of those toxic plants. And I think it's also really important to look at the toxic dose that's required. Poison hemlock's a great example. For poison hemlock to be lethal to livestock, they've got to consume 2.5% of their body weight. You know, if you've got 1,000-pound cow, she's probably not going to stand there and eat 25 pounds of poison hemlock at a time. And so I think kind of understanding how we can buffer some of those impacts is important. Good question.
And just building on what Dan says, that is an important consideration if you're combining management tools. And so we have had cases where forage was cut as a management practice on it, and there was poison hemlock there, and they didn't realize that there was poison hemlock intermixed. And so the cows then ate that cut forage, and they didn't have an opportunity to ice cream pick out what they wanted to eat. And so, and on the flip side, like during a drought per se, if you're adding supplemental feed, or if you decide to get livestock yourself and you're going to feed them during these non-vegetative growth points, it's important to think about where you're feeding them at. So pine needles can be toxic as well. We've had challenges up in Plumas and Sierra County with pine needle toxicity because hay was fed over the top of pine needles. And that's also, you know, on the other side, if you're not feeding enough, like Dan mentioned earlier, if they're full and content, they won't resort to most likely won't resort to those toxic plants or the acorns, which we see as a challenge during drought with cattle grazing.
That's a great point. A lot of the acorn and oak toxicity that I've seen here in the foothills is when we have a storm after the trees have leafed out in a drought year, and there's lots of green leaves knocked to the ground, and that's the only thing green out there on the landscape. So the common extension answer to all those questions is it depends. So infrastructure for small ruminants, you know, if you're hiring somebody, they're typically going to bring everything that they need. Access to stock water is the biggest factor, regardless of whether you're hiring somebody or leasing your property. That can really impact the value of the project or the property. If you're thinking about doing it yourself, I think it's really important to consider, do you have time to care for your livestock? And I will say that talking to the cattle folks around here in the foothills whose family started out with sheep, one of the reasons they went to cattle from sheep is that they didn't have time to take care of the sheep every day. And I think that's an important consideration. If I were doing it over again, I would start with temporary electric fence and animals that were trained to it. One of the reasons we'll sell a ewe is if she doesn't respect electric fence, she gets a one-way ticket to town. The stock water systems are important, and knowing how much water animals are going to consume at a particular time of year. You know, this time of year, once we get a little bit of rain, our sheep are consuming less than a half gallon apiece per day. In August, they're going to consume 2 gallons apiece per day. Tracy, what's a mature cow going to drink in August in the foothills?
It varies. I think the numbers are 18, 19 to 24 gallons a day. So it can be fairly significant because if they're not getting it from other sources. And so, like Dan said, it depends on a lot of factors, but it can be a significant amount, which, getting back to the question that was asked earlier that about Stephanie and disasters, that is a huge concern for livestock producers when there is a disaster or these power outages, is what is the reliability of water for multiple days without power.
So just to kind of compare costs with the Coast Range where Stephanie is, many of the projects that we're seeing here in the foothills are between $300 and $500 an acre. And it can be lower than that for a long-term contract. What we find is that the people involved in the project and the livestock have long-term memories. And so if they're coming back year after year, the people know where to put up the fence, the livestock know where to go get water. It all becomes more effective and less costly the longer we go. So leasing land for grazing, and Tracy, do you want to cover this part of it? Because I think this is largely more applicable to cattle than it would be to small ruminants.
Sure. So if you want to just do those, some key considerations are, one of them, I think, to start out with, if you are intending, maybe you have a larger size landscape to put in, or fix up your permanent fencing and lease it out to potentially a livestock or cattle grazer, or maybe a mixed species grazer, is that you want to have clear goals and objectives. And I think one of the big parts of that is having that two-way conversation of both the leasee and leaseor, of making sure to get started off on the right foot with great communication of what your objectives are for the land. And like Dan said, also balancing the fact that these livestock can't go on a bookshelf and be taken off when it's needed. And so how can you work with them to figure out how your property could fit in with other leases that they may have, or maybe it's just your neighbor of when they can put their cattle on your property and then they go back to their property. Another thing, like we were talking about earlier, is just the species and class of livestock that you need, whether it's sheep or cows or pairs of yearling, because all of them will eat different ones. Sorry, I have an assistant.
So I'll pick up. I think one of the things. Sorry
about that.
You got
it. Back in action now. And leasing can be more common for.
I'll pick up here. I think leasing is more common for cattle producers. I think the other thing to note is that the class of livestock can be important. Are they going to be calving on the property, or is it going to be yearlings? Yearling cattle can kind of be like handling teenagers in some respects. And so understanding what that requires in terms of fencing and other components of your infrastructure. If you're starting from scratch, knowing your stocking rate and season of use can be challenging. And Tracy's back, so I'll turn it back over to Tracy.
Sorry about that. Good thing we got this covered, Dan. And then I think just the exterior fencing, which we talked about earlier, is it's efficient, and what will it cost to have new fencing? There's been conversations that have taken place that, if you're going to do a lease, it's up to about 10 years to amortize that, sometimes over the cost of putting in permanent exterior fencing.
The most current rate I've heard here in Placer County is $10 a running foot for a barbed wire fence. So $50,000 a mile.
And just building on what Dan said, is really defining that livestock drinking water. It's a critical element. Does the leasee have access to the wells? Maybe it's your house well, or is there a livestock drinking water well? Are there streams and ponds, and what is the reliability of those during drought years and even during typical normal years? And then the last one is just, insurance is an important thing of, insurance coverage for you as well as the livestock owner, of having that defined or being additionally insured on their policy. And then I think there was one more is, Dan talked about, dealing with law enforcement and if your animals are out on the road. And so how quickly can they get there? And so this is really a concern for some of these larger parcels. If you have, contract or establish a lease with someone who might not be from the area, what is their response time to get there to deal with problem livestock or livestock out on the road or an infrastructure problem? So again, leasing is a two-way street, and the lessor and the leasee must strive to understand how the land resources may be managed to meet both of their combined goals.
And I think that's a really critical point. I think a good lease relationship requires really good communication and ongoing communication. both talking about goals and objectives up front, but then continuing to talk about how things are going. So a few things on predators. That mountain lion picture in the middle there is actually about 30 yards from where we lamb. And so we're dealing with predators on a fairly consistent basis. The young coyote and the very large black bear are up on a sheep permit on the Tahoe National Forest. And I believe that that shot of the wolf is from one of your trail cameras, Tracy.
Yep, on a trail camera on a ranch in Sierra Valley.
So typically, sheep and goats are going to be more susceptible, as I said, to predators than cattle, although to date, the cattle depredations, the wolf depredations have all been cattle, at least the official depredations. And so it is an issue if you're going to use livestock as a tool, both in terms of animal welfare and coexistence. The tools that many producers use, myself included, we do rely largely on livestock guardian dogs and electric fence. The only places I've ever lost animals to a predator have been where I've had hardwire fence and no guard dog. And so I think the combination of those tools, at least anecdotally in our operation and running in some fairly rough country, is that's a pretty good combination. There are other guardian animals out there, donkeys and llamas. My theory on llamas is that they look so strange to the predators in our habitat that they don't know what to do with them. But there are other tools out there. This picture on the upper left is a fox light, which is a kind of a scare device that emits random flashes of red, white, and blue lights after dark. I know that there are folks in Indian Valley who objected to having one of those next to their hot tub. It kind of ruined the ambiance of their hot tub. And the jury's still out on how effective they are over the long term. But there are tools for coping with predators in most California landscapes. Just a few takeaways. I think grazing for fuel load reduction requires a shift away from grazing for livestock production to really focusing on our landscape goals. We can use all of those impacts, not only removing vegetation, but trampling and cycling nutrients to our advantage. And I think this one can't be emphasized enough, that it can really complement some of the other tools that folks are using. It's a great maintenance tool. You may have noticed that fine fuels tend to grow back year after year after year. And so livestock can be a really effective tool for managing those fine fuels. And then it's not a one-time treatment. It's going to require some ongoing commitment. These are some resources that Tracy's put together, and I'll let you kind of talk on these a bit, Tracy.
So I just added it there in the chat, a link that is listed there, but some additional resources we have that Dan helped me with. One of them is Grazing for Change, that looks at using managed livestock grazing to reduce fire field load. So it really puts a lot of the conversation we've had here this evening into a book with a variety of stakeholders, with some of the targeted grazers that Dan has mentioned, as well as the leasing information that I shared, as well as some of those principles of livestock grazing and tools and resources. And so I shared that website, and that website builds upon our conversation this evening with a lot of the scientific references that Dan has mentioned, this book and case studies. And also, like all three of us who have been speakers this evening, Stephanie and Dan and I, look to your local cooperative extension advisor to help you maybe determine what might work best on your property, or if you have a question about how to get your lease started, or anything else. So we are a resource that is put to you there in your local communities. And if we don't have the answer, we will find someone that can help you get the answer that you have about using grazing as part of a management tool for your property.
And with that, and we'll make these slides available to everybody. Here's some additional references on some of the stuff that we've talked about tonight. And we'll answer questions. And I do see a question in the chat about what does caring for 5 sheep look like every day in terms of time commitment. So I'm going to use the common extension answer. It depends. I will tell a story on myself. When we started in the sheep business, we bought a dozen Barbados sheep, thinking that they would do better in the brush where we were going to graze them in Colfax. And the first two that we unloaded proceeded to jump over my head and disappear into the North Fork of the American River, where people would come out of the river on rafting trips for several years and talk about the wild bighorn sheep that they'd seen down at the river. So there is a learning curve with handling livestock, and I think sheep do require a bit more management, certainly than cattle, beef cattle. In terms of your daily time commitment, once you're good at it, very minimal time. As you're learning, maybe an hour a day to take care of 5 sheep. And I think it kind of depends on your comfort level in working with livestock. Good question. I will.
If you could expand a little bit, we talked a little earlier about animals during evacuations, mandatory evacuations due to wildfire and whatnot. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and what our landowners might expect?
Yeah, Tracy's had some really direct experience. We've worked on that here locally. So Tracy, maybe if you want to start.
So I think a big one is, if you are getting livestock, is to have an evacuation plan. And so whether that be that you're completely self-sufficient with a trailer or a box that can go in the back of your truck where you can load up your animals, or knowing a neighbor that has a trailer, that can be part of the plan where your animals are able to get smally pinned up. So when they come by with the trailer, that they can be easily put in, or, depending on where you're at, having an established communication with a friend or a neighbor or the livestock animal disaster groups that exist in a lot of these communities, of just having that relationship with them and being prepared. And so whether it's your neighbor coming to get them or someone else, how can you make it easy on everybody to have that? And so I think that is the first step in, like Stephanie mentioned, with some of these larger operations, it is more of a shelter in place system of where, once the fire has died down and it's safe, can we go in there and water the livestock, check their water, check their health, get them the feed that they need. Are there any that need to be medically treated? And then there are other cases that Stephanie also mentioned where I have coordinated, other ranchers going in to move cattle off a property without the landowner because it was deemed a high risk situation within 24 hours. And so wanting to get those cattle moved out of it. And so I think a lot of it, like Dan just says, it depends, but evacuation and disaster preparedness is something that I never thought was part of my position when I was hired, but it has become a huge part of it. And so it's something that I continually talk to producers about almost at every meeting, whether it be fire or flood or just family business, and how are your animals taken care of when tragedy strikes your community or your family. And so, and knowing the people that you can call for help to make sure that your animals stay cared for.
And I would only add a couple of things. We do a written plan during fire season for where our animals are and what we would do in the event of a wildfire. And in our case, even at our small scale, it's going to take 4 pretty good sized gooseneck loads to evacuate our animals. And generally they're going to be at a place where the address on my driver's license doesn't match the address where the sheep are located because it's all on somebody else's property. And so we identified places that we could put sheep while a fire burns past them, keep them safe. And then the other piece of that, and I think a lot of the livestock advisors have been working on these kinds of programs for commercial producers, is to work with law enforcement and fire officials to be able to get access after it may still be in an evacuation zone, but when it's safe for somebody to go in and feed and water livestock. I think the other piece, and Tracy alluded to this, it's taken me 20 years to be a good stock handler. And I'm a better stock handler today than I was when we started. I could load sheep in the middle of a road if I had to. I couldn't do that 20 years ago. And so I think training yourself and training your livestock to be able to safely deal with those kinds of high stress situations is part of what folks need to do. Good question.
Does anybody else have any questions for Dan or Tracy? put it in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, I have some questions. Would you consider for a moment how you would go about writing a grant application for targeted grazing? I'm thinking something along maybe NRCS EQIP grant, or writing, let's say, a U.S. Forest Service or a BLM grant to grazing to reduce fuel load. And I'm thinking this is an open-ended question, so I wanted to throw a couple considerations, conditions on it. For example, how do you deal with something like an endangered plant on public land, like BLM land, Darlingtonia, for example, or maybe elderberry? You know, the Sambuca species are protected because there is a elderberry beetle that is endangered, and I'm somewhat concerned about how you would show in a grant how you would evacuate animals. I recall the Stumpfield fire in Mariposa, and that's been like 25, 30 years ago, where the cattlemen rammed a CHIPS barricade to get through to get their cattle out. And there's two ways of looking at that. The CHIPS should have let them through. And the other thing is that the cattlemen were a little bit late, having to urgently remove them at the last second. And I'm particularly concerned about how you would deal with the inspections that the BLM and the Forest Service does. They do range inspections, and they look at the. I'm sure you're familiar with it. They have little systematic ways of measuring the plants in a meadow, and they'll look for the plants that mark good health in that meadow, and they'll rate that meadow as whether it is good, healthy or not. And you can basically, most of your animals like certain plants. You might call them ice cream plants, and they go for those and they eat those ice cream plants. And then there's the cod liver oil plants that they don't like. And so when you graze animals, there tends to be a shift in the species composition towards the cod liver oil plants and away from the ice cream plants.
So just
sure.
Just a couple of things there. I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think in terms of grazing management, what we do find when we're managing using those principles that I talked about in the slide, we can avoid overuse of the ice cream plants and underuse of the non-desirable plants and really manage that composition. There's two different things here. I think both BLM and Forest Service do manage grazing allotments, which are managed very much as you suggested. I know BLM has a contract where they pay a sheep grazer here in El Dorado County to come in and graze star thistle. And so their desire in that particular landscape is very different than on a grazing allotment where the grazer may be paying them. And so their standards and their utilization monitoring are different. They want to impact the yellow star thistle. Forest Service has recently completed a national environmental policy analysis of using grazing as a stewardship tool. And so rather than using grazing in their allotment system, they now have done the environmental analysis to be able to use grazing to come in and impact particular fuel conditions or vegetation. And so they've done that environmental analysis. On the state level, there is a new programmatic EIR for vegetation treatment in forested landscapes that includes analysis of prescribed fire, mechanical treatment, hand treatment, herbicides, and targeted grazing. And underneath that system now, if you are applying for state funding to do a fuels treatment project, you can tier your localized environmental analysis to that programmatic document, and it makes that a little bit easier. I know CAL FIRE has recently done a grant that's going to include about 1,000 acres of targeted grazing work here in the foothills. I just read today of another targeted grazing project in Santa Barbara County that they actually documented as stopping a wildfire down there this year. And so I think we're going to see more funding opportunities for those types of activities and the necessary environmental analysis to go with it.
Yeah, I'm looking for more detailed information, and maybe you have a better source. For example, if I were writing a grant and I would start out and say, well, let's masticate. That's a pre-treatment to perhaps prescribed fire. And when you release prescribed fire in the mulch, that's the chips that are created after mastication, you'll expect a different vegetation to come in. Now, Susie Coker said, perhaps, just sow some annual rye until such things as purple stipa grass comes in, which is an excellent forage. And then once that arrives, you can use a post-treatment of grazing to contain the fire risk from the grasses. So I'm wondering how you would approach that.
I think we could probably spend the rest of the evening and maybe the rest of the week talking about those kinds of examples. I have had experience in grazing on purple needlegrass, and again, it's an it depends question. I can graze it out of existence, and I can graze to its benefit depending on the timing, duration, and intensity of the grazing. And so I think from an environmental analysis standpoint, working with your livestock farm advisor is a place to start in terms of the grazing impacts and opportunities. Tracy, would you add something to that?
I was just going to build on that. Our the Plumas National Forest has a project that Cooperative Extension has been a part of, using, or that's in well, it was supposed to happen before the Dixie Fire, but that was looking at a combination between. That's my answer to everything usually before a fire. But anyways, it was looking with Cooperative Extension and the local RCD, as well as, the Butte County Fire Safe Council has some great projects going on with grazing. And so, my recommendation is, connect with your Cooperative Extension advisor to work on the details of that type of project. The RCDs can sometimes be a great asset as a local NGO quasi-government to be able to apply for these grants. And so there's these great partnerships in these local communities. And so I think connecting with them and working with your local advisor would be the best next step.
I want to get to Ryan's question because I always like sheep breed questions, and they're always important. I think there's a variety of sheep, Ryan, that would work on low shrubs. It's interesting, having worked with this outfit up in the Stampede country north of Truckee. Those are typical Western white-faced sheep, so largely Rambouillet genetics, and they'll walk past grass to eat brush in that landscape. So part of it's what they've grown up grazing and what they've been exposed to. You could bring a similar genetics that had never been in the mountains, and they wouldn't know what to do with that brush. I think most of the white-faced breeds that are a little more adaptable are going to be better than things like Suffolk or Hampshire sheep in those types of settings. There is some work apparently that's been done in Scandinavia using Shropshire sheep in tree plantations, in conifer plantations, to avoid impacts to conifers. I think it'd be interesting to look at some of that here too. And a question about fiber and hoof trimming. Shearing is absolutely an issue for fiber goats or fiber sheep. Amazingly enough, in talking with our vet specialist at Davis, we don't recommend trimming feet nearly as often as we used to, which my daughters are absolutely thrilled about because they're my foot trimming crew. But yeah, there is some maintenance with small ruminants that would not occur with cattle necessarily.